It's almost refreshing to see such a blunt portrayal of genuine savagery in characters who are supposed to be the protagonist. We're used to characters that we're meant to root for being watered down into something that reflects our modern values back to us. Like it's the nice version of the natives or the pirates or whatever other group of people that in all reality didn't share any of our values whatsoever. I don't know what kind of depressing dystopian future I'm going to get to experience before I die. I'm pretty sure the end result of all of this is the simulation, and it's probably just a matter of how quickly we all sign off on the metaverse. I don't know exactly how that sequence of events is going to go down. All I know is that if any part of it happens in my lifetime, I will have my period of time spent pillaging and terrorizing modern civilization, GTA style, wearing an Alexander Skarsgard skin. What's up, guys? It's Bromley. Today I'm going to cover Robert Eggers' The Northman. Now, this is an artfully done, beautiful film, and it's heavy. It's not that different than The Lighthouse or The Witch. I would say the plot is probably more digestible for more people. It is a more cut and dry hero's journey than something that's really abstract like The Lighthouse, but those artistic elements are still very present. It starts off with Alexander Skarsgard's character Amleth. He's a young boy. He's reunited with his father, Arvindil, who is the king, played by Ethan Hawke, who comes home after a long battle. Arvindil interacts with his son, who it's revealed he has a very close bond with, and his wife, Gudrun, played by Nicole Kidman. Arvindil takes his son Amleth to a sort of rite of passage where the jester, played beautifully by Willem Dafoe. Willem Dafoe, by the way, he's like the next level evolution of Nicolas Cage, where the battier he gets, the more exquisite it is. Say what you will about The Lighthouse, I love Willem Dafoe's crazy ass, and he plays off his rocker like nobody else. So a, 10th century Viking jester, like right up his alley. It was really well done. In this rite of passage, they basically crawl around like wolves, they eat mushrooms, and Amleth has a hallucination where he sees a visual representation of their family tree where the roots are literally impaling the dead bodies of their ancestors and showing what the future generations might look like as royalty. Now, Amleth has this transformative experience. He crawls out. This is the scene in the trailer where he's eating snow, and you get the sense that he's just had this huge psychedelic experience. Any of you that have done psilocybin or mushrooms, you know what it's like. It's like somebody took your brain out, like power washed it and put it back in, and the whole world looks a little bit different. And he doesn't get to experience that for more than 5 seconds before Fjolnir, his uncle, comes in and captures his father and beheads him in one of the most brutal ways I think I've seen depicted in cinema. Amleth gets away, and this is where he resolves that he is going to avenge his father, save his mother, and kill his uncle Fjolnir. Cut forward some 15 or 20 years, and Amleth is now this massive human being. He is perfectly depicted as a murder machine by Alexander Skarsgard. He's muscular and strong looking, but has a kind of thin wiriness that you would see in some type of like exotic predator. It's like the way those shaved cats look that you didn't quite expect. Like he kind of looks like if somebody shaved a jaguar and made it stand up on its hind legs. In this time, he was taken in by a band of Vikings and raised as a berserker. So he spends his time pillaging, and I mean fucking pillaging villages. Now, this is the first sign of one of the tropes of the movie, which is like the brutality of it all. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. But it's evident very early on that these are not the sympathetic good guys. They're not like normal movie protagonists. They flat out do not share your values, and they don't give a fuck. They are rounding everybody up, shoving them into buildings, setting the buildings on fire, killing women and children. They just very casually dispense of human life. So in the melee, as the slaves are rounded up and the ones who aren't fit to be slaves are dispensed of, Amleth hears that a group of them are going to Fjolnir. They're going to be sold to his uncle, who spent a brief time ruling as a king only before being dethroned himself, and now living in some sort of exile, looking over a small village in the hills. So Amleth does what any 9-foot-tall Viking does when they are fueled with blood vengeance. He takes the hot poker that they used to brand the slaves, brands himself as a slave, swims out and jumps on the slave boat, because I guess nobody's going to notice 20-foot-tall Alexander Skarsgard climbing into a boat with like 12 people in it. But he passes and he ends up slipping into the village for a little bit of subterfuge, a little bit of guerrilla warfare. And he vows, along with the Slavic slave Olga, to wreak havoc on the village and make Fjolnir's life absolutely miserable. So you have this absolute murderer of a human being, this killing machine, who has spent all of his time since this singular childhood trauma trying to reclaim this dream, this romanticized version of what his childhood was like. It's not even about usurping the throne. Even now, there's no throne to usurp. He never talks about taking his place as the rightful king, at least that I remember. It's always about avenging his father, saving his mother, and killing his uncle. There are some interesting plot developments that challenge his idealized view of his childhood, and these are some heavy, weighty moments. There's a few moments that just put an awful taste in your mouth, and it's part of the general grotesqueness of the culture and timeline that they portray in this movie. The whole thing culminates when him and his uncle face off in a battle, mano a mano, on the edge of a volcano that is currently active. It's a beautiful scene. It looks like it's reminiscent of 300, but nothing about this movie is really kind of watered down into that mindless, fun, visual appealing action type movie. A movie like 300 can easily be consumed by the masses. This one requires a little bit more work. So Amleth's time in the village, there's a mild element of suspense. You never really fear for him. I mean, for one, they just displayed how absolutely savage he was early on. It almost reminds me of Arnold Schwarzenegger in Conan the Barbarian. He's such a specimen and he stands so far above everybody else that it's not really like, oh my God, is he going to get caught and dealt with? It's really like, how many people is he going to brutalize in their sleep? They have this scene where they're playing this primitive ball game and they have Alexander Skarsgard line up almost like American football style, like on the line of scrimmage, against Hafthor Bjornsson. Hafthor Bjornsson is 6'9", was 450 pounds in his prime, and was the reigning world's strongest man, one of the strongest men who have ever lived. Alexander Skarsgard, like, kind of hangs with him in presence. That's how massive he is, even at a much lighter body weight. Now, when I think back on the movie, my memories of it are a little bit rosier than the actual experience, and I've had to kind of reframe how I thought about this movie since then. I responded to somebody in the comments who recommended that I did this review, that there were just as many pieces that I actually genuinely hated as there were pieces that I actually genuinely loved. And it's not just that I loved these pieces, it's that these elements that I recognized aren't done in movies. I loved them because they were bold, they were artistic, they stuck with you. And they were so different from what we get in the normal trash that gets pushed out. So that gives a film a ton of favor in my eyes. And it's also that dynamic between loving and hating that I think it brings it into this meta category. That's what real art should do. You don't rate real art on a scale of 1 to 10. So the fact that it was very like, God, I like it, but I hate it, and I keep thinking about it in all of these ways, it made for a very unique cinematic experience that you really don't get anymore. If I think back on it, there were a lot of moments where like the drama is really high, the violence is absolutely bloody, the scenery is beautiful, and you can tell that the art of storytelling through cinema is alive and well. And that gives me goosebumps. But when I think back to what my experience was sitting through it, I remember there being long stretches that were kind of flat, uninteresting, drawn out. It's a very long movie. Every artful movie is going to run the risk of doing that, where what the director, creator thinks is a very pointed moment that needs time and silence and space for people to experience it. Other people might find it boring or uninspiring and they might fall asleep in the middle of it. That's what art does, which is why you can't rate it, as easily on that linear scale. Now it's funny because as flat as I thought is some of the dialogue was, it's contrasted with the incredibly flamboyant and artful dialogue of some of the shaman and witch and seer type characters. The holy characters spoke in what felt like a very period accurate manner, even though it's a different language at the time. So of course it's not period accurate, but it was so artfully done. It's like when you read Old English, it's almost impossible to understand. And it added to the atmosphere. It added to the experience overall. It kind of reminded me of the plot of Tenet. Like, you're not supposed to think about it. You're supposed to just sit back and feel it. Now, the movie is bloody. It is gory. It's violent as hell. And you will come to find quickly that I give massive hall passes to movies for committing egregious cinema violations if they can just infuse an appropriate amount of creative over-the-top violence. I absolutely love B movies. I like the more recent horror movies that throw back to like 80s B movies. They use visual effects where The blood is like corn syrup with red dye, where the tissue being torn apart is like paper mache and SpaghettiOs. I love that shit. And the more creative it is, the more points I give it. This movie featured violence that made me squeal audibly in the movie theater, to the point where my wife, through very squinty eyes, looked at me and said, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" This movie is about Vikings running around 1,000 years ago, and the only mechanism they had to enact their blood vengeance and to fight over scarce resources were dull swords and blunt farming instruments. This movie acknowledges the role that violence played in this culture, and it doesn't shy away from what it looks like when somebody gets hit in the arm with a dull sword. If you've ever tried cutting through a beef bone with a knife, it doesn't matter how sharp the knife is, it ends up turning into like this labored sawing and hacking motion, and you end up getting like winded and your arm kind of burns, you're sweating, and then the bone ends up looking just hacked to pieces and you didn't even cut through it all the way. Like, that is what replaces what we normally get, which is the watered down, shiny Hollywood violence that isn't rooted in reality. Now, the gore of the movie is matched with like its general grotesqueness. The themes, I mean, part of it is from like the savage reality of living at that time. Part of it's from the reality of humans existing while so gleefully disregarding human life and tormenting and raiding and raping other people. Part of it is through the dramatic events that force Amleth to come to terms with this new reality that conflicts with his idealized version of his childhood as he remembers it. It's almost refreshing to see such a blunt portrayal of genuine savagery in characters who are supposed to be the protagonist. We're used to characters that we're meant to root for being watered down into something that reflects our modern values back to us. Like, it's the nice version of the natives or the pirates or whatever other group of people that in all reality didn't share any of our values whatsoever. We're used to characters that value human life, that don't lay hands on women and children, that are selfless, and really concern themselves with how their actions affect everybody else. The characters in this movie do not give a fuck, and they don't pretend to. Now, I don't think we need to redefine what our ideas of heroes are, but I think it is important that we frame the hero's journey properly. We are so used to, if you're the center of the story, you're the good guy. And the good guy means that you're good. You're good for the sake of being good. It means you have all the right character and virtue. Just like you can watch a documentary that follows the journey of a pride of lions and watches them plot to get their next kill, you can follow that and almost personify those creatures the way you would think of human beings and almost relate to them on that level. But you never even go to the point where you assign morality to it. It seems silly, right? We very easily and obviously skip over the question of morality when it comes to animals. And it's almost similar here. You have people in a different place operating off a different set of rules. There's meaning in the journey, but we lose something when we water it down or when we force the story to just mirror the things that we take for granted as being important. So now it's fancy literary explication time. The word for today is juxtaposition. Everything about the movie that just puts a bad fucking taste in your mouth is juxtaposed with the absolute beauty. There is so much beauty in this movie, so many scenes that are breathtaking, so many visual effects that are kind of shocking and interesting. All of the horror that I just went over, from the type of violence that makes your asshole clench shut to the grim, depressing reality of a harsh existence framed by basic disregard of human life, is all starkly contrasted by the absolute beauty of this movie. There's psychedelic hallucinations, there's Valkyries riding across the landscape, even the shots of the rolling green hills, which at first glance might seem plain. They have a type of majesty and almost fantasy element to them. And Anna Joy Taylor and Alexander Skarsgard are just beautiful fucking people. So watching them, it's like watching a wolf or something. Their aesthetic is so sleek and vicious. They almost look perfectly manicured, right up until they stick their face in the belly of something that they just killed. Like, that's what I think of. I think of like a beautiful predator covering its face in blood. There is a hard juxtaposition here. Now, there's also an element of half fantasy here, and I really like it when they do it well. Now, instead of just saying that here's all the magic and shit, just deal with it, this movie tries to be a melding of like historically accurate elements and the lore that defined the culture of the time. It blends the fantasy in a way that's really ambiguous and continuously leaves you wondering if this is actually a world driven by gods, witches, curses, prophecy, or if it's just a point of view experience of how those raised in a culture like this feel the impact of those superstitions. As fun as general fantasy elements are, this goes several steps further by immersing you in a culture that is so deeply entrenched in belief that you can't separate it from what's real. Did Amleth actually receive prophecy from witches and seers? Was he actually freed by ravens? Did he actually fight an undead knight? Did a Valkyrie actually carry him to Valhalla? Whether these things are or are not doesn't matter. It's the fact of the doubt and uncertainty that makes it almost a more real experience. And whatever conclusion you come to, the beauty and the meaning behind the movie holds up all the same. I'm going to rank this film high. It's definitely climbed up on my list since I've seen it. This review was mainly done out of just my memory. And the fact that I was able to pull so much out of it just off of memory, that tells how much of it stuck. And that tells how much weight and depth and deliberate artfulness was infused into the movie by the creators. I have a lot of respect for it, and I think more highly of the movie because of it. We're not ranking candy bars here. It's not just how many dopamine receptors does this hit the first time around. You have to be willing to bring your stuff to the experience and have it meet halfway in this kind of gray area with whatever the intentions of the artist were. And it's not always good, it's not always bad, but it's always an experience, and that has value. So instead of ranking 0 to 10, I'm just going to rank it as genuine art. It might seem pretentious, but all good art risks being that to some people. I don't think that invalidates what it does well. There are just so many pieces of skill that were required in its creation, and there was so much deliberate artistic intention in it. I recommend you go watch this movie with an open mind, aim to have an experience, think about it over a few days, and then at some point in the future, go and see it again. That's the type of attention this film deserves. And if you're not willing to do that, fair enough. Then I recommend that you actually skip it. So that's my review of The Northman. Thank you for stopping by, guys. If you have any comments, if you want to tell us how you thought of the movie, things you pulled out of it, what your experience was like, go ahead and drop it in the comments. If you think it was really just pretentious art house trash, tell us about that too. Thanks again, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.